Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. This week I thought I would address something on a more philosophical level. This coming book study session, we're going to be doing the Rupa and Arupa realms, and that involves some consideration of the concept of space in the Buddhist teachings. So I thought I might say a few words about some of these more abstract ideas of space and time, reality, and so on in the Buddhist thought. The first consideration to take into mind when dealing with any of the Buddhist teachings in general, but the sort of philosophical issues particularly, is not to impose our own modern cultural conceptions onto the teachings. Every human being lives embedded in some cultural matrix, and it's very common for people to assume that their assumptions about things are universal or ultimate because they're shared, culturally shared. This reflection has also been on my mind because I've also recently been reading Oswald Spengler, and it's a very interesting turn of the 20th century philosopher of history and culture particularly, and he sees every culture as having a unique vision that's never fully understood by other cultures. And one of the really defining marks of this is their conception of space. And if we look in the Buddhist texts, we see that the idea of space is somewhat, or quite a bit, different from our own. We have the sense of space being extended infinitely and being, in a sense, a kind of real matrix, particularly at very modern physics. The post-Einstein space is seen as some kind of an entity that is affected by mass and so on. It's different in the ancient Indian tradition. Now, there's a kind of quirky anomaly between the Theravada and Sarvastivada schools. The Sarvastivada gave a reality to space, and the Theravada did not. But the Sarvastivada denied the reality of time, but the Theravada gave it a reality. So there's a opposite conceptions. Space for the Sarvastivada view was classed as an unconditioned. Nibbana and space in the Sarvastivada Abhidhamma were classed as the two unconditions, like unchangeable, immutable, ultimate kind of realities. The Theravada, I think the really exemplary aspects of Theravada thought is that they kept the concept of Nibbana, or the unconditioned, very pristine and pure, and really try to avoid mixing it up with concepts and definitions. And part of this was that it stood alone as the only unconditioned element. Space was classed according to the type of space, and this was a distinction made as either conditioned or unreal, or just a concept. They classified three kinds of space. There's the space that is created when you say dig a hole to make a well. You open up a space in the ground, and that's obviously conditioned because it arises due to causes and conditions. A guy with a shovel makes that space. Then there's the space that is used in meditation, in the formless meditations, when you take a casino object, for example, and extend it to infinity and then abstract it away to contemplate the space underneath. So it's the space that is formally occupied by something in the mind. So this is a pure concept. It's not ultimately real. It's just a mental construction, a sankhara of the mind. And then there is this third definition, closest to what the modern West would define as space. Space is units of distance in between two objects or points. So you can say it's so many miles between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg, and there's a space in between. So many yojanas to the top of Mount Sunaru, and there's the space in between. And this is also classed as simply a mental convenience, a fiction, that there's no ultimate reality to the space. The reality is in the points, and then the space in between is just a designation. And this points out what I think is really the particular genius of India, and reached its culmination or its high point in the Buddha and Buddhist thought subsequently, is a appreciation of voidness, of emptiness or nullity. India then invented the zero. Nobody else had the thought that you could represent mathematically nothingness. A 0 point didn't make any sense to the Greeks, for example. So we see in Indian thought some subtleties that are very difficult for us to, with our cultural conditioning, is very difficult for us to grasp, such as which comes up several times in the Buddhist text, the tetralemma, the fourfold logic. In Greek or Western logic, you have A or not A and a law of the excluded middle. It's a dual logic, a binary logic. In Indian logic, you have no law of the excluded middle. Instead, you have four poles, A, not A, both A and not A, and neither A nor not A. And that last one is very difficult for us to wrap our heads around what exactly that could mean. This comes up, for example, in the sutta where the Buddha this is probably the most famous or the most prevalent context in the Buddhist text, is stating the condition of a Tathagata, or a fully enlightened one, after death. And the wanderer asked the Buddha, does the Tathagata exist after death? That does not fit the case. Does he not exist after death? That does not fit the case. Does he both exist and not exist? Does not fit the case. Neither exist nor not exist. Does not fit the case. Because what we're talking about here really is the unconditioned, which is the death of parinibbana of a Buddha or an enlightened one. There's an entry into parinibbana. There's no longer any samsaric becoming. So this is a way of expressing to the Indian mind that this is completely inconceivable It falls outside the bounds of the logical categories, which are considerably more flexible than our logical categories. You know, our way of thinking is founded on the Greek uh, logical binary logic. We would say either he exists after death or he doesn't, and there's nothing in between. You know? The Indian already adds two extra, and then the Buddhist says, "Oh, none of these apply." So the idea of space as a nullity, as a non-existent, is quite natural to the Indian mind, but we want to, in our minds, we want to make something of it. We generally want to reify things. As for time, um, the Sarvastivada school, the name means all exists, because their particular signature doctrine was that past, present, and future all exist. And there's one of the debates in the Katawatu about this, and the Theravada position is the past does not exist because it has ceased without remainder, and the future does not exist because it has not yet come into manifestation, and only the present moment exists. There's a Tibetan teaching that takes it a little bit of a step further and says even the present moment does not exist because it's unfixable. It's like a vanishing point. You know? The Sarvastivada view is that past, present, and future all have a reality. They all exist. The best way I can attempt to understand this, I'm not quite sure if I'm doing justice to the Sarvastivadin theory, but I think what it means is that consciousness moves through time, that it's only a perception that these are separate times, that there's and this is this is akin to some of modern some modern physical philosophizing, you might say, about time and space, that time is essentially a fourth dimension, and that we only perceive it in this kind of linear past the future way because of the way our minds and consciousness is structured, that we're moving through this fourth dimension and experiencing it moment by moment. There was one modern physicist who used the analogy as like an ant crawling across the checkered tablecloth. And the ant comes up with the theory that the universe turns alternately red and white. So when we're thinking about time and space, and in these sort of deeper questions generally, we need to realize that other people in other times and places understood things quite differently than we do, and there's no reason to stick with our given cultural forms, you know, and to assume that they represent some kind of ultimate reality. It's not even an easy question to answer. You know, what is reality? What is ultimate reality? In the texts like the Visuddhimagga, they make a distinction between ultimate reality and conventional reality, or ultimate dhammas and constructed dhammas, paramatta and pariyatti. And the ultimately real is, one definition is the Four Noble Truths, or the ultimately real. That is dukkha, cause of dukkha, the ending of dukkha and the path leading to the end of dukkha. So suffering is real. And this is a statement somewhere that suffering is real, but the one who suffers is not real. A person is a constructed reality, a conventional reality. And in Abhidhamma, the ultimate realities are considered the dhammas, the momentary point instants, which again is this Theravada view of time comes up here, in that the present moment is real, composed of dhammas, like atomic point instants. And those are the only ultimately real phenomena. And everything on a more constructed level, like a human being or the planet, or anything like that, is conventional reality. It's a constructed reality. It has no intrinsic reality to it other than the way our minds perceive and manipulate the dhammas into these organized structures as a way of negotiating the world, right? As a way of dealing with reality as experienced. It's a sort of a abstraction. We construct beings and places and so on out of these phenomena. And they're considered conventionally true. Now, that's also a subtlety of Indian thought, is that we tend to fall back onto binary thinking and imagine something as either true or false, whereas the Indian mind allowed for degrees of truth. There's ultimate truth and there's conventional truth. The conventional truth is not a falsity, it's not a false thing, but it's less true, it's not ultimately true as the Paramattha Dhammas. The Jains had a system with 7 levels of truth, 7 different degrees of something being true. Generally, the Buddhists kept it to 2, and 3 if you add in false. It's something that's completely false, something that's conventionally true, and something that's ultimately true. So we deal with something like a self, a person, personality, an entity as a conventionally true, because obviously it has a functional existence. It's something we work with and interact with each other and recognize our own position and relationships based on conventional concept of a self as an entity. But it does not have any ultimate ontological standing. Dhammas themselves are actually without essence. They don't exist from their own side. So all these kind of concepts are ways we attempt to make sense of phenomena and understand things and function. And we need to always try and keep clear these different levels. That there's that with conventional reality and there's the ultimate reality. And not to make the mistake of investing the conventional reality with a metaphysical or ontological substance. The Buddha said, use conventional speech, but do not be fooled thereby. So we call things by conventional names, and we're able to deal with the world and with ourselves and each other on this conventional level, but not to give that a philosophical or metaphysical ultimate reality. And I think if people had that view generally, the social relations between people would improve. Because one of the reasons that people don't get along is you can imagine or invest a permanent reality into a person. Like, this is an angry person, this is a bad person, or this is a good person, this is a kind person. And that may be conventionally true for limited circumstances and limited time and conditions and space, but since the person has no ultimate reality, there's only good and bad dhammas being made, kammas, skillful and unskillful kammas being made in a series, and there's no permanence to it. And that's one of the arguments that I seen in a book by a Tibetan writer making a philosophical case against the materialist view of mind, that the fact that the mind of an individual can turn around completely, and someone like Angulimala becomes, from a serial killer, he becomes a enlightened being. Um, that shows that it's not mechanical or algorithmic, that it can change direction quite unexpectedly. Because there's no permanence. There is habitual karma. We tend to create for ourselves ruts that we carry on, the same sort of patterns, and that can last for years, decades, lifetimes, even multiple lifetimes. But they're not real, they're not permanent, and they can change. This idea of a Dhamma as an ultimate constituent of reality highlights also this Indian appreciation of nothingness or emptiness, and their concepts of space and time. The Russian Buddhist writer Sherbatsky, who called it Dhamma, he translated as point instant. And I love that definition. So point mathematically is zero dimensions. There's no length or breadth. It's only a location only. And an instant is used in calculus. It's a mathematical concept of time as a point in time with no duration, the time equivalent of a point. So a point instant is a zero. It's a nullity. It's empty in its own essence. So this gives us an attempt to come up with some concepts of ultimate reality. It ends up coming to an emptiness, a nullity. It's always fascinating to me that modern physics approaches this view as well. That the further they got into the nature of the atom and particles, the less substance they found. It became more and more a concept. There's a science fiction story takes place in some future after some kind of nuclear war, and civilization is coming back, and they're starting to recover some old books and trying to figure out physics again. And this one character says to the other, well, what is this electron that they're talking about? He says, closest I can get to understanding it, it's a negative twist of nothingness. That's as good a definition as any. And everything is composed of these bits of nothing. And this brings us in the end back to our own minds, because it's in our own minds that we construct a reality, we construct a universe that we live in based on sense impressions. And it becomes an unsettled question as to exactly what the reality outside of ourselves is. Because we can never know it directly. We only know it via signals arriving through the senses. And our faculty of perception creates what is basically a simulation that we actually experience and live in. And I think that the Buddha's approach to this sort of question, his advice would be not to be overly concerned with trying to decide what the ultimate outer reality is, because you can never know it. He said when we talk about the world, loka, we're talking about this fathom-long body, meaning the world is the equivalent of the being. The being creates the world. Or in another place he said the world are these six senses and nothing more. And I think the general tendency of the Theravada has been that the nature of the ultimate reality outside of ourselves is undecipherable, undecidable. It's like the simile of the poisoned arrow. As a man is struck with a poisoned arrow, and the surgeon comes to pull the arrow out, and the man says, wait, before you pull the arrow out, I must know what kind of wood the shaft was made from, what kind of stone the head was made from, what kind of bird provided the feathers for the fletching, and whether the man who fired the arrow was tall or short, whether he was a nobleman or a commoner. Says if by the time all these questions were answered, the guy would be dead. So the thing is to get the poisoned arrow out. So the point is to make an end of suffering, not to try and figure out all the kind of philosophical niceties that in the end are unknowable, indecipherable. So I think I'll stop there.
Mayam Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Dharamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu